Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most famous disaster stories ever written, the plagues of Egypt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's mystery together. Long before historians, archaeologists, and scientists started arguing about environmental disasters and ancient climate events, there was simply the story. And it is not a subtle one. The 10 plagues of Egypt appear in the book of Exodus and form one of the most dramatic sequences in the entire Bible. Even people who have never opened the text usually know at least a few of the highlights. Rivers turning to blood, frogs absolutely everywhere, swarms of insects, livestock dying, a sky that suddenly goes dark for 3 days, and finally, a mysterious final plague that convinces Pharaoh that maybe keeping millions of angry slaves was not the best management strategy. According to the biblical narrative, it all begins when Moses confronts Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, with a fairly straightforward request. Let the Israelites go. Pharaoh refuses, which, according to the story, turns out to be a spectacularly bad decision, because what follows is essentially a series of escalating disasters that make Egypt look less like the most powerful civilization in the ancient world, and more like the setting of a very unfortunate nature documentary. First, the Nile turns to blood. Now, the Nile was not just a river to the Egyptians, it was the entire foundation of their civilization. It provided water, irrigation, transportation, fish, trade routes, and probably most of their daily patience. So when that river suddenly becomes undrinkable and full of dead fish, things go downhill very quickly. Then come the frogs. Lots of frogs. The text describes them appearing everywhere. Houses, kitchens, bedrooms, ovens. Which means the ancient Egyptians briefly experienced something similar to a biblical version of a plumbing disaster. Once the frogs die, things get worse. Because now you have rotting animals everywhere, which attracts insects. Swarms of gnats and flies appear, livestock begin dying, and people develop painful boils. Then the sky decides to get involved. A violent hailstorm destroys crops. Locusts arrive to eat whatever survived the hail, and at one point the land is covered in darkness for 3 days. At this stage, Egypt is essentially dealing with the ancient equivalent of a cascading environmental meltdown. And then comes the final plague, the death of the firstborn. It is the moment that finally breaks Pharaoh's resistance and leads to the Exodus. For thousands of years, believers have read this story as divine intervention. But modern historians and scientists sometimes look at it and think something slightly different. That is an awful lot of disasters, occurring in a very suspicious sequence, and that raises a curious possibility. What if the story is remembering real events? Not miracles necessarily, but a chain reaction of catastrophes that ancient people tried to explain the only way they could. Now here is where historians run into their first problem. The story of the plagues is incredibly famous, but finding historical evidence for it is complicated. Because when people imagine ancient Egypt, they often picture a civilization that recorded everything. Temples covered in hieroglyphs. Papyrus scrolls filled with detailed accounts of kings, battles, and daily life. And that image is mostly accurate. Ancient Egypt produced a massive amount of written material. Pharaohs loved documenting their victories, their building projects, and the many ways the gods clearly approved of their leadership. What they did not enjoy documenting was failure, or disasters, or national embarrassment. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions were not written as objective history. They were royal propaganda. Their purpose was to glorify the pharaoh and demonstrate that Egypt was stable, prosperous, and favoured by the gods. Which means, if something truly catastrophic happened, it probably would not appear on temple walls. Imagine a modern government proudly publishing an official monument that says, "In the 10th year of Pharaoh's reign, the river turned into a biological nightmare. Frogs invaded every kitchen, insects filled the air, crops were destroyed, and then everyone panicked. That monument probably would not make it past the approval committee. So historians face a strange situation. If the plagues were purely religious storytelling, we would not expect to find evidence. But if something like them actually happened, Egypt might still have chosen not to record it. That means researchers have to look in unusual places. Indirect evidence, environmental clues, ancient documents that describe chaos rather than royal victories. And occasionally, historians stumble across texts that sound strangely familiar. One of the most famous examples is something called the Ipuwer Papyrus. This ancient Egyptian text describes a time when the land was filled with disorder. Social order collapses. The poor rise up. Death spreads through the population. And one particular line catches everyone's attention. It describes the river as blood. Now historians immediately raise their eyebrows at that sentence. Not because it proves the biblical story happened, but because it suggests that ancient Egyptians themselves remembered periods when things went terribly wrong. And when historians see ancient texts describing rivers of blood, societal collapse, and widespread disaster, they begin asking questions. Because sometimes history does not disappear completely. Sometimes it survives as fragments of memory, even if those memories are a little dramatic. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence often mentioned in discussions about the biblical plagues is a document known as the Ipuwer Papyrus. The name sounds mysterious, but the document itself is essentially an ancient Egyptian text describing a period of chaos and social collapse. It is sometimes called the Admonitions of Ipuwer, and it reads less like a calm historical report and more like someone describing a society that has completely fallen apart, which, as you might imagine, immediately caught the attention of historians. The papyrus was discovered in the 19th century and is currently housed in a museum in the Netherlands. The text itself appears to have been copied during the New Kingdom period, but scholars believe the original composition may be much older, and the descriptions inside it are dramatic. The writer laments that the land is in chaos. Social order has broken down. Servants have become masters. The wealthy are suffering while the poor have taken their place. Violence and disorder seem to spread everywhere. But the line that usually gets the most attention is this one: the river is blood. Now, if that phrase sounds familiar, it is because it resembles the first plague described in Exodus. Naturally, this similarity has led some people to wonder whether the Ipuwer Papyrus might be describing the same events. But historians immediately urge caution. The text is poetic and symbolic. Ancient Egyptian literature often used dramatic imagery to describe political or social upheaval. When a writer says the river is blood, it might not mean the Nile literally turned red. It might simply be a metaphor for chaos or violence. And there is another complication. Dating the text precisely is difficult. Scholars disagree about when the original story was composed, and the surviving copy was written centuries later. So while the Ipuwer Papyrus is fascinating, it cannot be treated as direct proof of the biblical plagues. Still, it raises an interesting possibility. Ancient Egyptians themselves remembered periods of turmoil and disaster, and sometimes those memories appear in strange ways within ancient texts. The real question is not whether the Ipuwer Papyrus proves the Exodus story. It does not. The real question is something slightly more subtle. Could stories like the plagues have grown from memories of real catastrophes that ancient people struggled to explain? Because when natural disasters strike ancient societies, they rarely get recorded as calm scientific observations. They get recorded as stories, and those stories often survive far longer than the disasters themselves. If historians try to look for natural explanations behind the plagues, the first place they usually start is with the Nile. Because if something went wrong with the Nile, everything in Egypt would go wrong immediately afterward. Ancient Egyptian civilization depended on that river more than almost any other society depended on a single natural resource. The Nile provided water, irrigation for crops, transportation routes, fish for food, and the annual flooding that made agriculture possible. If the Nile failed, Egypt failed. So when the book of Exodus begins its list of plagues with the Nile turning to blood, Scientists immediately start asking what kind of environmental event could produce something like that. Now, to be clear, no river literally turns into blood. If that happened today, scientists would be less concerned with algae and more concerned with the apocalypse. But rivers can turn red. One possible explanation is something called a harmful algal bloom. Certain microorganisms can multiply rapidly under the right environmental conditions, especially when water becomes warmer or contaminated with nutrients. Some species produce pigments that turn the water deep red or reddish-brown, and many of them produce toxins. When these blooms occur, fish die in huge numbers because the water becomes depleted of oxygen. The river can become foul-smelling, undrinkable, and dangerous for animals and humans alike. To ancient observers, the effect would have been terrifying. Imagine waking up to find that the river your entire civilization depends on has suddenly changed colour. Fish are floating dead along the banks, and the water smells so bad no one wants to drink it. You might not immediately think algal bloom. You might think something far more dramatic. And if the Nile became polluted or toxic, it would trigger a cascade of consequences across the ecosystem. Fish would die. Animals that lived in the water would flee. And suddenly, creatures that normally stayed hidden inside the river would begin appearing everywhere else. Which leads directly to the second plague, the frogs. And once frogs start fleeing the river in massive numbers, the entire chain reaction of environmental chaos might already be underway, because ecosystems have a habit of collapsing in very inconvenient ways, especially when their main river suddenly stops cooperating. If the Nile really did become polluted or toxic for some reason, the next plague described in Exodus suddenly starts to make a surprising amount of sense. Frogs. A lot of frogs. According to the biblical account, frogs poured out of the river and spread across the land. They filled homes, kitchens, ovens, and sleeping areas. Basically, anywhere an ancient Egyptian might reasonably expect not to find frogs. There were frogs, which must have made daily life extremely awkward. But amphibians behave in very predictable ways when their environment becomes dangerous. Frogs spend most of their lives in or near water. Their skin is highly sensitive to toxins, oxygen levels, and pollution. If the water becomes contaminated, they are often among the first creatures to abandon it. So if something made the Nile suddenly toxic, frogs would not politely stay where they were. They would leave, quickly, and they would leave in enormous numbers. Modern ecological disasters sometimes show exactly this behaviour. When wetlands or rivers become polluted, amphibians flee the water and spread across nearby land as they search for safer environments. To the people watching this happen in ancient Egypt, the result would look like a full-scale frog invasion. But there is another important detail. Frogs do not survive long away from water. So if huge numbers of frogs escaped the river and spread across the countryside, many of them would soon begin dying. Which brings us to the next part of the ecological domino effect. Dead animals. And lots of them. Once frogs die in large numbers, their bodies begin decomposing, and decomposition attracts something that ancient people probably disliked even more than frogs: insects. Rotting organic matter is basically an invitation for flies, gnats, and other insects to reproduce rapidly. Their populations can explode in a very short time, when food sources suddenly appear everywhere. So the frog invasion might have been only the beginning. First the river becomes toxic, then frogs flee the water, then frogs die across the land. And suddenly Egypt is dealing with something much worse than amphibians. Because when insect populations explode, they bring more than annoyance. They bring disease. And the next plagues described in Exodus involve exactly that: swarms of insects filling the air, which suggests that the environmental chain reaction might have already been in full motion. Once large numbers of frogs die across the countryside, the ecological situation begins to change rapidly. Because nature has a very efficient cleanup crew: insects. When organic matter begins decomposing, flies, gnats, mosquitoes, and other insects multiply extremely quickly. Their life cycles are short, which means their populations can explode in just a few days if conditions are right. And if thousands of frogs suddenly died across the Nile Valley, conditions would definitely be right. The book of Exodus describes two plagues that involve insects. First comes lice or gnats, then comes swarms of flies. To ancient people, these would have seemed like two separate supernatural punishments. But from an ecological perspective, they might simply represent different stages of the same outbreak. Gnats and biting insects often breed in damp soil, stagnant water, or decaying organic matter. If the Nile ecosystem had been disrupted and amphibians were dying across the land, insect populations would likely rise very quickly. And once insects begin multiplying, they bring another problem with them: disease. Many insects are vectors for bacteria and parasites. They can carry pathogens from animal carcasses to livestock, crops, and humans. Modern epidemiology has shown how quickly insect-borne diseases can spread in environments where sanitation breaks down. Ancient Egypt would have been especially vulnerable. The Nile Valley was densely populated. People lived close to their animals. Water sources were shared by humans, livestock, and wildlife. If insects carrying bacteria suddenly became widespread, outbreaks of disease could follow. The biblical sequence actually reflects this possibility quite closely. After the swarms of insects come plagues affecting livestock. Then painful boils appear among humans and animals. To modern scientists, that progression looks less like separate supernatural events and more like a cascade of biological consequences. First insects spread, then infections spread. And once disease begins moving through animal populations, the entire agricultural system starts to suffer. Livestock provide milk, meat, transportation and farming power. If animals begin dying in large numbers, food production collapses. And that kind of collapse can quickly turn environmental disruption into a full-scale societal crisis. To ancient Egyptians watching these events unfold, the situation would have seemed terrifying. Because the disasters were not stopping, each problem seemed to trigger another one. And the next stage of the plagues would make the situation even worse. Because now the diseases begin killing the animals that Egypt depended on most. After the swarms of insects come one of the most economically devastating plagues described in Exodus: the death of livestock. According to the biblical account, horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats across Egypt begin dying in large numbers. For an ancient agricultural society, this would have been more than a tragedy. It would have been a disaster for the entire economy. Livestock were not just food in ancient Egypt. They were transportation, farming equipment, fertilizer, milk production, leather, wool, and wealth, all wrapped into one very useful animal. So, when the Bible describes livestock dying across the land, historians immediately start wondering what kind of disease might cause something like that. And once again, the previous plagues may offer a clue. If insect populations exploded because of decaying animals and environmental disruption, those insects could easily spread bacteria and viruses between animals. Modern veterinary science shows that insect-borne diseases can spread rapidly through herds. One possible candidate often mentioned is anthrax. Anthrax bacteria live in soil and can infect grazing animals such as cattle and sheep. Insects that feed on infected animals can carry the bacteria to other livestock, spreading the disease quickly. Anthrax infections can kill animals very suddenly, sometimes within a day or two. To ancient observers, this would look terrifyingly mysterious. Healthy animals would suddenly collapse and die with little warning, and once large numbers of livestock begin dying, the consequences ripple outward across the entire society. Farmers lose their ploughing animals, milk production drops, food supplies shrink, trade suffers, and worst of all, diseases affecting animals can sometimes spread to humans as well. Which brings us to the next plague described in Exodus: boils. Painful skin sores appearing on both people and animals. Now, if you are noticing that each plague seems to logically follow the previous one, you are not alone. Some scientists believe the biblical sequence may actually preserve a surprisingly accurate description of how environmental disasters cascade through ecosystems. One problem leads to another, which leads to another, until an entire civilization is dealing with multiple crises at the same time, and Egypt, already weakened by ecological collapse and disease, was about to face something even worse, a storm powerful enough to destroy the country's crops. After livestock begin dying across the countryside, the biblical narrative describes another disturbing development. Painful boils appear on both humans and animals. Now, at first glance, this plague seems different from the previous ones. Turning water red, frogs fleeing the river, insect swarms, livestock disease. Those events can all be connected through environmental chain reactions. But boils? That sounds more like a medical mystery. However, when scientists look at ecosystems under stress, the appearance of skin diseases actually fits surprisingly well into the pattern we have already been discussing. Because when insect populations explode and animal diseases spread, humans often become the next victims. Insects, such as flies, mosquitoes, and biting gnats, are extremely effective carriers of bacteria. They feed on infected animals and then move to new hosts, spreading pathogens from one organism to another. If Egypt had been dealing with massive insect swarms following widespread animal deaths, the conditions would have been perfect for infectious disease outbreaks. Some researchers have suggested that illnesses like anthrax, glanders, or other bacterial infections could produce symptoms similar to the boils described in Exodus. Anthrax, for example, can cause severe skin lesions in humans known as cutaneous anthrax. These infections begin as small sores, but can quickly become painful blackened wounds. To ancient people with no understanding of bacteria, such symptoms would have appeared terrifying and inexplicable. Imagine living in a society where the river has already failed, animals are dying across farms, insects fill the air, and now painful sores are appearing on people's bodies. At this point, the situation would have felt less like a series of random events and more like the world itself turning against you. And from a psychological perspective, that matters. Ancient societies interpreted disasters through religious and spiritual frameworks. When multiple crises occurred in rapid succession, people often believed divine forces were responsible. So if Egyptians were witnessing disease spreading among animals and humans at the same time as ecological collapse, they may have interpreted it as divine punishment. But the disasters were not finished. Because after disease weakens an agricultural society, the next major threat becomes something even more destructive: weather. And according to the biblical account, the next plague brought one of the most violent storms Egypt had ever seen. A storm that destroyed crops, shattered trees, and made the crisis even worse. By the time the story reaches the seventh plague, Egypt is already having a very bad year. The river has failed. Frogs have invaded the countryside. Insects are everywhere. Livestock are dying. Disease is spreading among people. At this point, most ancient civilizations would already be struggling. But according to the book of Exodus, the disasters are not finished. Next comes a violent storm unlike anything Egypt had seen before. The text describes thunder, lightning, and hail falling from the sky, with enough force to destroy crops, break trees, and kill animals caught outside. For ancient Egyptians, this would have been especially shocking. Because severe hailstorms are extremely rare in Egypt. The Nile Valley has a hot, dry climate, and while storms do occur, large hail is unusual. So if a particularly intense storm system formed, it would have seemed extraordinary. Modern meteorology offers a possible explanation. Under certain atmospheric conditions, powerful storms can form even in regions where they are normally uncommon. When warm air near the ground rises rapidly into colder air above, massive storm clouds can develop. Inside those clouds, water droplets are carried upward repeatedly by strong updrafts, freezing into ice and growing larger each time they cycle through the storm. Eventually, the ice becomes too heavy to remain suspended, and hail begins falling. If such a storm struck agricultural areas already weakened by earlier disasters, the consequences would be severe. Crops that had survived disease and environmental disruption would suddenly be destroyed. Trees could be damaged. Fields flattened. In an ancient society dependent on yearly harvests, this kind of storm could create widespread food shortages almost overnight. But the biblical sequence suggests something even worse happened next. After the hailstorm passed, the land was left vulnerable. The crops that remained were already damaged, and damaged crops attract a particular type of visitor: locusts. Now, locust swarms are one of the most destructive natural events recorded in agricultural history. A large swarm can contain billions of insects and travel hundreds of kilometers in search of food. When they arrive, they eat everything: leaves, stems, grain, even bark. So if Egypt had already suffered ecological collapse, disease, and crop damage from storms, the arrival of a locust swarm would not just be another inconvenience, it would be catastrophic. Because once the locusts arrive, the food supply disappears almost completely. After the hailstorm destroys much of Egypt's crops, the Book of Exodus describes the next disaster arriving almost immediately: locusts. And if you have never seen a locust swarm in real life, it is difficult to imagine how destructive they can be. Locusts are not just ordinary grasshoppers. Under certain environmental conditions, these insects change behavior. They gather in enormous groups and enter what scientists call the gregarious phase, forming massive swarms that move across entire regions. A single swarm can contain tens of billions of insects. Yes, billions. And every one of them is hungry. When locust swarms land on farmland, they consume almost everything green. Crops disappear. Leaves vanish from trees. Even the bark of plants can be stripped away. Modern locust swarms in Africa and the Middle East have devastated agriculture within hours. So, when Exodus describes locusts devouring whatever remained after the hailstorm, historians and scientists nod slightly, because that is exactly what locusts do. If Egyptian crops were already weakened by earlier disasters, the fields would have been extremely vulnerable, and locusts are remarkably good at finding struggling farmland. Wind patterns can carry swarms hundreds of kilometers. They often appear suddenly, covering the sky like a moving cloud. Ancient writers sometimes describe the sun being darkened by locusts in flight. To people witnessing this thousands of years ago, the experience would have been overwhelming. Imagine standing in your fields watching the sky fill with insects. Then they land. And within hours, the crops you depended on for the entire year are gone. Grain, vegetables, fruit trees, everything. For a civilization whose stability depended on predictable harvests, this kind of disaster could create immediate famine conditions. And when food supplies collapse, societies begin to panic. The biblical account suggests Egypt was now facing exactly that situation. The Nile had already failed. Animals were dying. Disease was spreading. Storms had destroyed crops. And now locusts had eaten what little remained. At this point, Egypt was no longer dealing with a single disaster. It was experiencing what scientists call a cascade failure, one crisis triggering the next. And according to the story, the next plague would be one of the most mysterious of all. 3 days of darkness. After rivers fail, animals die, crops are destroyed, and locusts eat whatever survives, the biblical narrative introduces one of the strangest plagues of all: darkness. Not ordinary nighttime darkness, but 3 full days in which, according to the Book of Exodus, the land of Egypt was covered in such thick darkness that people could not see one another or leave their homes. That description has puzzled historians for centuries, because darkness lasting that long is not something that normally happens in the Nile Valley. But scientists studying ancient environmental disasters have suggested a few possible explanations. One of the most discussed involves volcanic eruptions. Around the time many scholars place the Exodus story, the Mediterranean world experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history, the eruption of Thera on the island of Santorini. This massive volcanic explosion sent ash and debris high into the atmosphere and spread volcanic material across huge areas of the eastern Mediterranean. Ash clouds from eruptions can travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. When they do, they can block sunlight and create eerie dark skies over distant regions. Even far from the eruption itself, the atmosphere can become hazy, dim, and unsettling. Ancient people witnessing such conditions would have had no scientific explanation. To them, the sun itself might appear to disappear. Another possible explanation involves massive sandstorms. Egypt sometimes experiences powerful desert storms known as Kamsin winds, which can fill the air with thick clouds of dust. These storms can darken the sky dramatically, reducing visibility and turning daylight into an eerie twilight. In extreme cases, the air can become so filled with dust that breathing becomes difficult and people remain indoors. Now imagine such a storm occurring after a series of other disasters. Crops gone, animals dead, insects everywhere, disease spreading, and suddenly the sky itself turns dark. At that point, ancient Egyptians might not have seen it as a weather event. They might have believed the entire natural world was turning against them. But according to the biblical narrative, even this terrifying darkness was not the final disaster. One more plague remained, and it would become the most haunting and mysterious of them all, the death of the firstborn. After 9 disasters, the book of Exodus describes the final and most terrifying plague, the death of the firstborn. According to the biblical narrative, during a single night the firstborn child in every Egyptian household died. The text describes grief spreading across the land as families discovered that their eldest sons had suddenly perished. This is the moment that finally breaks Pharaoh's resistance. After this plague, he allows the Israelites to leave Egypt. For historians, however, this plague is the most difficult to explain. Many of the earlier plagues can be connected to environmental chain reactions, polluted water, insect outbreaks, disease among animals, agricultural collapse, and unusual weather events. But the death of the firstborn? That is harder. Some researchers have proposed a theory involving toxic grain. If Egypt had suffered ecological disasters, crop damage, and poor storage conditions, certain types of fungi could grow on stored grain. Some of these fungi produce powerful toxins. One example is ergot fungus, which can contaminate cereal grains under humid conditions. Another possibility involves molds that produce poisonous compounds, capable of causing severe illness or death. Now imagine a famine situation. Food is scarce. Families rely heavily on whatever grain remains in storage. In many ancient households, the eldest family members or the heads of households often received the first portion of food, which might mean they would consume the largest quantities of contaminated grain. That could create a pattern where the firstborn sons or leading family members were affected first. But historians are careful here. There is no direct evidence proving that something like this occurred in Egypt during the time traditionally associated with the Exodus. The theory simply shows how environmental disasters could potentially lead to unusual patterns of illness. Another possibility is that the final plague represents symbolic storytelling rather than a literal event. Ancient texts often use powerful narrative elements to emphasize the climax of a story. In this interpretation, the death of the firstborn symbolizes the final collapse of Pharaoh's power and the ultimate judgment against Egypt. So while earlier plagues might reflect memories of real disasters, the final plague could have been shaped by centuries of religious storytelling. And that raises an important point. Ancient stories often preserve fragments of real events, but over time those events are retold, interpreted, and transformed into something much larger than the original experience. Which means the real mystery of the plagues may not be whether they happened exactly as written, but whether ancient people were remembering a catastrophe. That history only partially remembers today. When historians examine ancient texts like the Book of Exodus, they often ask a different question than the one most people expect. Not simply, did this happen exactly as written, but rather, what real events might be hiding inside the story? Because throughout human history, societies have preserved memories of disasters through storytelling. Earthquakes become legends of angry gods. Floods become stories of divine punishment. Volcanic eruptions become tales of fire raining from the sky. And once these events pass into cultural memory, they are retold again and again across generations. Details change, meaning evolves, but the core memory often survives. The plagues of Egypt may fit this pattern. If Egypt experienced a series of environmental disasters, polluted water, animal die-offs, insect outbreaks, crop destruction, and unusual weather events. Those events would have been terrifying for people living through them. Ancient Egyptians and Israelites did not have microbiology, meteorology, or environmental science to explain what they were witnessing. Instead, they interpreted the events through religion and divine power. To them, disasters were not random. They were messages from the gods. And this interpretation was not unique to Egypt. Nearly every ancient culture explained catastrophic events through supernatural forces. Storms, droughts, eclipses, and disease outbreaks were often viewed as signs of divine anger or intervention. So if a real environmental crisis struck Egypt and coincided with a political or social upheaval, such as the migration of enslaved populations, those events could easily become intertwined in collective memory. Over time, the disasters might be remembered not simply as natural events, but as a sequence of divine acts leading to the liberation of a people. This does not mean the story is fictional, but it also does not mean the events occurred exactly as written. Instead, it suggests something historians see quite often: real events becoming legendary history. The core experience survives, but the explanation surrounding it changes. And when stories are told for thousands of years, they rarely stay simple. They become powerful narratives filled with symbolism, meaning, and cultural identity. Which means the plagues of Egypt might not be just a religious story. They might be a memory of a time when nature itself turned against one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, and people tried to explain it the only way they knew how. At this point, a very reasonable question appears. If Egypt experienced disasters on the scale described in the plagues, wouldn't Egyptian records mention it? After all, ancient Egypt left behind an enormous amount of written material. Temples, monuments, tomb inscriptions, and papyrus documents describe everything from military campaigns to tax collections. Surely something that dramatic would appear somewhere. But here is where historians encounter a fascinating problem. Ancient Egyptian records were not neutral historical reports. They were political messaging. Pharaohs controlled the official narrative of history, and that narrative had one primary purpose: to demonstrate that the ruler was powerful, favoured by the gods, and fully in control of the kingdom. So the monuments we see today tend to celebrate victories, triumphant battles, successful building projects, foreign enemies defeated, divine blessings received. What we almost never see are official records describing national humiliation or catastrophic failure. You do not find temple carvings that say something like, "Year 12 of Pharaoh's reign, the river failed, insects covered the land, crops were destroyed, and the royal administration had absolutely no idea what was happening." That kind of honesty was not common in royal propaganda. This means that the absence of Egyptian records describing the plagues does not necessarily prove the events never happened. It simply means that official inscriptions were unlikely to record them. However, historians still search for indirect clues. Periods of political instability, evidence of famine, signs of environmental disruption. Occasionally they find hints that Egypt experienced difficult periods during certain centuries, but none of these clues can be definitively connected to the Exodus story. So historians remain cautious. There is no direct archaeological or written evidence proving that the plagues happened exactly as described in the Bible. At the same time, there is also no evidence that definitively disproves the possibility that real disasters inspired the story. And that uncertainty is where historical research often lives. Some questions remain unresolved. The Exodus narrative sits right at the intersection of history, religion, and ancient memory, which means that even after centuries of research, historians still cannot give a simple answer. But the mystery itself is part of what makes the story so enduring, because the plagues of Egypt exist in a strange place between two worlds: faith and history. So after centuries of debate, research, and scientific investigation, where does that leave us? Did the biblical plagues actually happen? The honest answer is, we do not know. There is no clear historical document that confirms the entire sequence of plagues exactly as described in the Book of Exodus. No Egyptian monument describing frogs in the palace kitchens or royal scribes complaining about catastrophic insect infestations. But the absence of proof does not automatically mean the story was invented from nothing. History often leaves gaps, especially when the events involve disasters, social upheaval, or the downfall of powerful leaders who preferred their monuments to show victory rather than embarrassment. And when historians examine the plagues closely, something interesting appears. Many of them follow a surprisingly logical pattern. A polluted river could drive animals out of the water. Dead animals could attract insects. Insects could spread disease. Disease could kill livestock and infect people. Storms and locusts could destroy weakened crops. Environmental stress could push an already struggling society toward famine and chaos. In other words, the biblical sequence reads almost like a chain reaction, one crisis triggering the next. Now, that does not prove the plagues happened exactly as written. Ancient writers often shaped stories to convey meaning, morality, and theology. Over generations, real events can grow into powerful narratives filled with symbolism and dramatic detail. But it does suggest something important. The story may contain echoes of real experiences, memories of environmental disasters, political instability, or social upheaval that ancient people struggled to understand. And when humans try to explain frightening events they cannot control, they often turn to the most powerful explanation available: divine intervention. For believers, the plagues remain a powerful example of faith and divine justice. For historians, they remain a fascinating puzzle, a story that may contain fragments of real history hidden beneath layers of storytelling. And that mystery is part of why the plagues of Egypt continue to capture our imagination thousands of years later. Because sometimes history does not give us clear answers. Sometimes it leaves us with questions. And occasionally those questions survive longer than the civilizations that first asked them. A pale April morning settles over the docks of Southampton. The harbour is alive with noise, though not the frantic noise of chaos. Instead, it is the steady rhythm of departure. Porters shout instructions. Steam whistles echo across the water. Somewhere nearby, gulls circle above the masts of smaller ships, complaining loudly as if they disapprove of the enormous newcomer dominating their harbour. You arrive in a carriage that slows beside a long wooden pier. When the door opens and you step out, the first thing you notice is the crowd. Not just passengers, but families, reporters, dock workers, and curious spectators who have come simply to witness the departure of the largest ship ever built. Then you look up, and there it is. The Titanic rises above the harbour like a moving city that has somehow decided to pause for a moment beside the shore. Her black hull stretches so far along the quay that your eyes struggle to take it all in. Above the hull sits a gleaming white superstructure lined with endless rows of windows and promenades. And towering above everything are 4 massive funnels painted in warm buff and black, quietly breathing smoke into the morning air. It is difficult not to stare. Even the dock workers, men who spend their lives around ships, glance upward now and then, as if they still cannot quite believe this vessel is real. A steward in a dark uniform approaches you politely. He tips his hat and checks your ticket. First class. Immediately, a porter appears to collect your luggage. He handles your trunks carefully, as if he already knows they will soon be resting inside rooms that resemble those of a grand hotel, rather than a ship crossing the Atlantic. You walk toward the gangway. A small string quartet is playing nearby, the soft music drifting through the cool morning air. It is not loud, just enough to give the moment an atmosphere of calm elegance. Ladies in wide hats move slowly toward the boarding ramp. Gentlemen in tailored coats pause to admire the ship before stepping aboard. And as you reach the foot of the gangway, you realize something. This is not merely a voyage. It feels like the beginning of an experience people will talk about for the rest of their lives. You place one foot on the ramp. Ahead of you waits the most luxurious ship the world has ever seen. The moment you step aboard, the atmosphere changes. Behind you, the docks of Southampton are still loud and busy, filled with shouting porters and curious onlookers. But ahead of you, inside the ship, everything becomes strangely calm. The noise fades, replaced by a quiet order that feels almost ceremonial. A steward greets you immediately. He stands perfectly straight in a dark uniform, white gloves folded neatly behind his back. When he sees your first-class ticket, his expression shifts into a warm and practiced smile. "Welcome aboard, sir." Your luggage has already vanished somewhere below deck, taken by porters who seem to know exactly where everything must go. It feels effortless, as though the ship itself has begun to take care of you. You follow the steward inside. The first interior corridor surprises you. Ships, in your mind, are supposed to feel cramped and narrow, but here the hallways are wide and brightly lit. Polished wood panels line the walls, glowing softly beneath electric lights. Thick carpets soften every step. Yes, electric lights. Already the Titanic feels less like a vessel crossing the Atlantic and more like a grand hotel that simply happens to float. The steward leads you toward the heart of the ship. You round a corner and suddenly stop. Before you stands the grand staircase. It rises upward through the decks like the centerpiece of a palace. Carved oak railings curve gracefully around the staircase, and delicate ironwork gleams beneath warm lights. Above it all is a large glass dome, allowing soft daylight to spill down into the room. Passengers stand nearby, simply admiring it. Ladies whisper to one another. Gentlemen tilt their heads upward, studying the details of the carved wood and ornate decorations. Someone quietly remarks that it looks more like the lobby of a luxury hotel in Paris than the interior of a ship. Your steward waits patiently, as though he has seen this reaction many times before. He gestures gently toward the stairs. Your suite is just above. You ascend slowly, your hand gliding along the smooth oak railing. Every step reveals another glimpse of luxury. Velvet chairs rest along the walls. Brass lamps glow warmly. A large clock stands at the landing, its carved figure symbolizing honor and glory crowning time. Everything here is designed to impress. And it works. As you reach the next deck, you begin to understand something. This voyage is not merely about crossing the Atlantic Ocean. It is about doing so in a world of comfort, elegance, and effortless luxury that very few people on Earth will ever experience. At the top of the staircase, the steward guides you along a quiet corridor lined with polished wood and thick carpet that muffles every footstep. The hallway feels less like part of a ship and more like the upper floor of an elegant hotel. Brass lamps glow softly against cream-coloured walls, and the faint scent of fresh polish lingers in the air. Your steward stops before a door. He unlocks it with a small brass key and opens it smoothly. Your suite. You step inside. For a moment, you simply stand there. This is not the cramped cabin you might expect aboard a ship. Instead, the room resembles a private apartment. A sitting room greets you first, furnished with upholstered chairs, a writing desk, and a small table set beside a window. The furniture is polished mahogany, and the cushions are covered in soft fabric that looks as if it belongs in a fine London townhouse. Light pours through the large porthole. Outside, the harbour of Southampton is still busy. Tugboats move slowly beside the giant hull. Dock workers walk along the pier below. Yet from inside this room, the chaos feels distant and quiet. Your luggage has already arrived. The porter has placed your trunks neatly beside the wardrobe. A second door reveals the bedroom, where a comfortable bed waits beneath crisp white sheets. The mattress looks thick and inviting, clearly designed for travellers who expect a proper night's sleep, even while crossing the Atlantic Ocean. There is even something remarkable for a ship. A private bathroom. A small porcelain sink gleams beside polished fixtures, and hot and cold running water are available at the turn of a handle. For many passengers aboard most ships, such conveniences would be unimaginable. But aboard the Titanic, luxury is simply expected. You walk slowly around the suite. A steward appears again to ensure everything meets your expectations. He explains the electric call button near the bed, the heating system that keeps the room warm even in cold Atlantic winds, and the dining schedule for the evening. Tonight's dinner will be served in the first-class dining saloon. Multiple courses, fine china, crystal glasses, the sort of meal one might expect in the finest restaurants of London or Paris. When the steward leaves, the room becomes quiet again. Through the window, you see the dock beginning to grow smaller as the ship prepares to depart. You sit for a moment in the chair beside the window and realise something extraordinary. For the next several days, this floating palace will be your home. After settling into your suite, curiosity quickly pulls you back into the corridors of the ship. Remaining inside such a luxurious room feels almost wasteful when an entire floating city waits to be explored. You make your way toward the promenade deck. The corridor gradually brightens as sunlight filters through large windows. Soon, a steward opens a door, and a breath of cool sea air greets you. You step outside. The promenade stretches along the side of the ship like a long seaside boulevard. Polished wooden planks run beneath your shoes, perfectly clean and smooth. A white railing separates the deck from the vast harbour beyond. Southampton spreads out behind you. From this height, the docks appear smaller, almost toy-like. Tugboats puff gently beside the Titanic's enormous hull, and crowds still linger along the pier to watch the great liner prepare for departure. Passengers stroll leisurely along the deck. Ladies in elegant dresses walk arm in arm beneath wide hats decorated with ribbons and feathers. Gentlemen wear tailored coats and polished shoes, moving with the relaxed confidence of people who know they are aboard the most luxurious ship ever built. Deck chairs have already been arranged along the railing. Thick blankets are folded neatly across them, ready for passengers who wish to sit and enjoy the ocean air during the voyage. You lean slightly against the rail. The ship is so large that movement is almost impossible to notice. Only the slow shifting of the harbour view tells you that the Titanic is beginning to stir. A deep vibration hums through the deck as the engines come alive far below. It is not loud, just a gentle pulse beneath your feet, like the steady heartbeat of some enormous mechanical creature. Nearby, a small group of musicians begins to play softly. The music drifts across the deck, mixing with the distant sounds of the harbour. It gives the moment a strange sense of ceremony, as though the ship's departure is not simply travel, but an event worthy of quiet celebration. Passengers pause to watch. Some wave toward friends and family on the docks. Others stand silently, simply admiring the scale of the vessel that now carries them toward the Atlantic. The shoreline begins to drift slowly away. Buildings shrink. The pier grows distant. And as the Titanic glides steadily into open water, you begin to feel something remarkable. You are no longer standing in a harbour. You are standing on the deck of the most magnificent ship in the world, beginning a journey across the vast Atlantic Ocean. By evening, the Titanic has settled into the gentle rhythm of the open sea. The distant coast of England has disappeared behind the horizon, leaving only the vast Atlantic stretching endlessly in every direction. A steward delivers a polite reminder to your suite. Dinner will soon be served. You dress carefully. First-class dining aboard the Titanic is not a casual affair. Gentlemen wear evening coats and polished shoes. Ladies appear in elegant gowns that shimmer softly beneath electric light. Even before reaching the dining room, the atmosphere feels more like a grand social event than a simple meal. You make your way down the staircase once again. The ship is alive with quiet activity. Passengers move through the corridors, exchanging greetings and conversation. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of music drifts through the halls. Soon you arrive at the entrance to the first-class dining saloon. Two stewards stand beside the doorway, guiding guests to their assigned tables. When you step inside, the sheer size of the room is almost overwhelming. The dining saloon stretches across a vast portion of the ship, its high ceiling supported by elegant columns painted in soft white. Electric lights glow warmly above, reflecting off polished silverware and crystal glasses arranged across hundreds of tables. White linen covers every surface. The room hums with quiet conversation, the gentle clink of china, and the soft movement of waiters weaving skillfully between the tables. You are guided to your seat. Almost immediately, a waiter appears with the first course. The meal is elaborate, carefully planned and served with the precision of a fine European restaurant. The menu includes delicacies few ships would even attempt to serve at sea. Fresh oysters, rich soups, perfectly prepared fish and roasted meats. Each course arrives beautifully presented on fine china bearing the emblem of the White Star Line. Crystal glasses catch the light as wine is poured. Around you, conversations flow easily. Wealthy businessmen discuss investments. Aristocrats speak of London and Paris. Travellers bound for New York share their plans for the weeks ahead. It is easy to forget that you are hundreds of miles from land. Everything about this room is designed to create the illusion of stability, elegance, and effortless comfort. Course follows course, each more impressive than the last. And as the final plates are cleared and dessert arrives beneath the glow of electric chandeliers, one thought becomes impossible to ignore. No ship in history has ever offered an experience quite like this. Dinner ends slowly, the final plates cleared while waiters glide quietly between the tables like practiced dancers. Guests rise one by one, adjusting coats and gowns, continuing conversations as they drift out of the dining saloon. But the evening aboard the Titanic is far from over. A steward suggests the first-class lounge. You follow the gentle flow of passengers down a corridor and soon arrive at another remarkable room. The lounge feels warm and inviting, designed not for spectacle like the dining saloon, but for comfort and conversation. Large windows line the walls, though now they reveal only darkness outside. The Atlantic stretches endlessly beyond the glass, invisible except for the occasional glimmer of moonlight on the waves. Inside, however, the atmosphere is lively. Comfortable armchairs and small tables fill the room. Gentlemen sit together discussing business ventures and politics, while ladies gather nearby exchanging stories of London society and upcoming seasons in New York. A pianist plays softly in the corner. The music is calm, elegant, and perfectly suited to the quiet luxury of the room. It blends with the murmur of conversation, creating a soothing background that makes time seem to slow. A steward offers you a drink. Crystal glasses appear on silver trays, filled with fine wines and spirits. Cigars are available for those who wish to enjoy them in the designated smoking areas of the ship. You settle into one of the deep chairs. The upholstery is thick and comfortable, and the warmth of the room contrasts pleasantly with the cool ocean air you felt earlier on the promenade deck. Passengers around you seem perfectly at ease. It is easy to see why. The Titanic has been designed to remove every inconvenience from the experience of ocean travel. There is no rocking discomfort, no cramped quarters, no sense of danger. Instead, there is quiet elegance. Across the room, a group of passengers begins discussing the ship itself. They admire the engineering that makes such a voyage possible. Some speak confidently about the Titanic's advanced safety features. Many repeat the same phrase with a tone of admiration. The ship is practically unsinkable. The idea spreads through the room like a comforting certainty. After all, with her size, her steel construction, and her modern design, what danger could possibly threaten such a vessel? The pianist continues to play, and as the evening drifts peacefully onward, no one in the lounge can imagine that history will soon prove those confident words tragically wrong. Eventually the lounge begins to quiet. Some passengers return to their suites. Others move toward the smoking room or remain seated in conversation, unwilling to let such a pleasant evening end too quickly. But you feel drawn back toward the open air. You step out into the corridor and follow the familiar path toward the promenade deck. When the door opens, the cool Atlantic night greets you. The change from the warm interior of the ship is immediate. A fresh breeze moves across the deck, carrying the clean scent of the open ocean. The sounds inside the ship fade behind you, replaced by the steady hush of water moving along the Titanic's hull. Night has completely fallen. Above you stretches a sky filled with stars so bright and numerous that they almost seem unreal. Far from the lights of cities, the heavens reveal themselves with remarkable clarity. The Milky Way forms a faint glowing band across the darkness, and countless stars shimmer like scattered diamonds. The ocean below mirrors that silence. You walk slowly along the deck. Only a few other passengers are outside now. A couple leans quietly against the railing, speaking in soft voices. Farther down the deck, a gentleman sits alone in a deck chair, wrapped in a blanket, while gazing at the sky. The Titanic moves forward with calm confidence. The engines produce a deep, steady vibration beneath the deck, barely noticeable but reassuring in its rhythm. Every few seconds the bow cuts through the water ahead, sending soft ripples outward into the dark Atlantic. You rest your hands on the railing. From here, the ship's immense size becomes clear. The promenade stretches far ahead and behind you, disappearing into shadows beneath electric deck lamps. Somewhere forward near the bow, the sea breaks gently against the hull as the Titanic pushes onward across the vast ocean. It feels peaceful. The ship seems unstoppable. With its immense size and modern engineering, it moves through the water with a quiet strength that inspires complete confidence. Passengers aboard speak often about the same thing. This vessel is the greatest achievement of modern travel. You remain there for several minutes, breathing in the cold ocean air and watching the stars drift slowly across the sky. Finally, you turn back toward the warmth of the ship. Tomorrow will bring another day of comfort, exploration, and luxury aboard the most magnificent liner ever built. And tonight, the Atlantic appears calm, endless, and perfectly safe. Morning arrives quietly aboard the Titanic. You wake slowly, noticing first the gentle stillness of the room. There is no harsh rocking, no sudden noises that might remind you that you are far out at sea. Instead, the ship moves with such smooth confidence that the sensation is almost like resting in a grand hotel that simply happens to glide across the ocean. A soft knock comes at the door. Your steward enters politely carrying a breakfast tray. Silver dishes rest neatly upon it, and steam rises from a pot of fresh tea. Toast, eggs, and fruit have been prepared with the same careful attention you saw at last night's dinner. Even breakfast here feels luxurious. You thank the steward, and after he leaves, you open the curtains beside the window. Sunlight floods the suite. Outside, the Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction. The water is calm, its surface gently rolling beneath the pale morning sky. There is no land in sight, only the faint white wake trailing behind the Titanic as she continues steadily westward. You dress and step out into the corridor. The ship is already alive with activity. First-class passengers move through the halls with relaxed confidence, as if this floating palace has become completely familiar overnight. Some are heading toward the dining saloon for breakfast. Others are already making their way to the promenade deck to enjoy the fresh morning air. You follow them outside. The sunlight transforms the ship. Yesterday's quiet elegance now feels brighter and more lively. Deck chairs are arranged along the railing, many already occupied by passengers reading newspapers or sipping coffee, while wrapped comfortably in blankets. The sea sparkles in the distance. A steward walks past carrying a tray of warm drinks. Somewhere nearby, a small group of passengers discusses the remarkable speed of the Titanic. Despite her immense size, she crosses the Atlantic with impressive efficiency. Yet there is no rush. Passengers stroll slowly along the deck, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of life aboard the ship. Some talk about the ports they have visited in Europe. Others speak excitedly about the arrival in New York that awaits them in just a few days. Everything feels safe, controlled, and perfectly planned. The Titanic continues forward across the Atlantic with quiet power. And standing there in the morning sunlight, surrounded by comfort and calm, it is impossible to imagine that anything could interrupt such a magnificent voyage. The day drifts by with the gentle rhythm that seems to define life aboard the Titanic. Hours pass almost unnoticed. Passengers stroll the decks, read in the lounges, and gather for meals that feel more like elegant social events than simple necessities. By evening, the Atlantic sky begins to darken once again. You return to the promenade after dinner drawn by the quiet beauty of the open ocean at night. The air has grown colder since morning, and the breeze carries a sharper edge as it moves across the deck. Stewards have already placed blankets over the deck chairs, anticipating passengers who wish to linger outside beneath the stars. The ship moves forward with steady confidence. Far below, the engines continue their quiet, powerful rhythm. The vibration beneath your feet is faint but constant, a reminder that the Titanic is pushing forward across the vast ocean at remarkable speed. Above you, the sky is perfectly clear. The stars appear even brighter than the night before. Without clouds or moonlight to soften them, they glitter with an almost eerie sharpness. The ocean below reflects nothing but darkness, a deep black expanse stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Passengers move calmly along the deck. Some walk slowly, enjoying the fresh air before returning inside. Others lean quietly against the railings, watching the sea glide past the hull of the ship. Laughter and conversation drift through the cool night air. From somewhere inside the ship, faint music can still be heard. The Titanic feels invincible. That thought seems to hang quietly in the air. With her massive steel hull, advanced engineering, and luxurious design, she represents the peak of human achievement. Many passengers speak of her with pride, confident they are travelling aboard the safest vessel ever constructed. Yet the ocean remains vast and silent. You stand at the railing for a moment longer, watching the dark water rush past the bow. The night feels peaceful, almost hypnotic, as the ship cuts steadily through the Atlantic. Eventually you turn back toward the warm lights of the ship's interior. Tomorrow will bring another day of comfort, conversation, and elegance aboard the most famous liner in the world. And as the Titanic continues her journey westward through the calm, star-filled night, no one aboard can yet imagine how suddenly this perfect voyage will change. The year is 1920. Only a few years earlier, the world had been trapped in one of the darkest conflicts in human history. The First World War had scarred continents, shattered empires, and left entire generations carrying the weight of loss. Cities across Europe were still rebuilding, and millions of families were learning to live with the quiet absence of fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. For a moment, it seemed as though the world might sink into a long era of exhaustion. But something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating into silence and caution, society erupted with energy. Across the United States and Europe, people felt an almost urgent desire to live again. After years of rationing, fear, and discipline, the appetite for pleasure returned with incredible force. Restaurants filled, music halls reopened. Dance floors came alive with laughter and movement. It was as if the world had collectively decided that life was simply too short to waste. New technologies began to transform daily life. Automobiles rolled off factory lines in growing numbers, allowing ordinary people to travel farther than ever before. Radios appeared in living rooms, bringing music and news directly into homes. Electric lights illuminated city streets late into the night, turning urban centres into glowing landscapes of possibility. Wealth also seemed to expand at astonishing speed. The stock market climbed higher year after year, and investors spoke confidently about a future of endless prosperity. Businessmen made fortunes in industries that had barely existed a decade earlier. Suddenly there were more millionaires than ever before, and with wealth came extravagance. Grand hotels filled with champagne and laughter. Private clubs hosted lavish parties that lasted until sunrise. The upper classes dressed in silk and pearls, while orchestras played energetic new rhythms that encouraged people to dance without restraint. In many ways, the spirit of this new decade echoed something familiar. Only 8 years earlier, the Titanic had represented the peak of luxury and confidence in the modern world. That floating palace symbolized a belief that progress and wealth could build a perfect future. The 1920s carried that same spirit, but now it had spread across entire cities. The world seemed convinced that a brilliant new age had arrived, an era of glamour, music, and endless celebration. Few people stopped to wonder how long such a dazzling moment could truly last. As the 1920s gathered momentum, the great cities of the world began to transform. Places that had once grown quiet after sunset now seemed determined to remain awake all night. Electric lights spilled from theatre marquees, restaurant windows, and hotel lobbies, turning city streets into glowing rivers of movement and noise. New York was perhaps the most dramatic example. Broadway blazed with bright signs and crowded sidewalks. Taxi horns echoed through Manhattan while crowds poured in and out of music halls, dance clubs, and rooftop restaurants. The city had always been lively, but now it felt almost unstoppable. Paris was no different. Cafes spilled out onto the sidewalks where artists, writers, and musicians gathered late into the night. The sound of laughter mixed with the rhythm of jazz drifting from small clubs hidden in narrow streets. The city that had survived war and hardship suddenly rediscovered its appetite for beauty and celebration. Berlin, too, pulsed with life. The German capital became famous for its daring nightlife. Cabarets hosted performances that were bold, artistic, and sometimes scandalous. Visitors described Berlin as a place where the rules of society seemed to loosen after dark. The world's cities had become stages, and people were eager to perform. Fashion changed quickly to match this new atmosphere. Men wore sleek suits and polished shoes, projecting the confidence of businessmen in a booming economy. Women began to reject the heavy clothing of earlier decades, choosing lighter dresses that allowed them to move freely on the dance floor. Short haircuts became fashionable. The new generation of young women, often called flappers, embraced independence with striking confidence. They danced, smoked, and spoke openly in ways that shocked the older generation. Music filled the air. Jazz spread rapidly through clubs and theatres, bringing new rhythms that encouraged people to move with energy and spontaneity. Trumpets, pianos, and saxophones replaced the restrained orchestras of earlier years. Dancing became faster, louder, and far more exciting. In many ways, the atmosphere of the 1920s resembled a permanent celebration. The world had endured tragedy, and now people were determined to make up for lost time. Every night seemed like an opportunity to experience something extraordinary. Cities had become playgrounds of light, music, and motion, and for those living through it, the future appeared brighter than ever before. If the cities of the 1920s had a heartbeat, it was jazz. The music seemed to arrive everywhere at once, spilling out of clubs, dance halls, and radios with a rhythm that felt entirely new. Unlike the formal orchestras of earlier generations, jazz carried an energy that encouraged improvisation, movement, and spontaneity. It was lively, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. In cities like New Orleans, Chicago, and New York, musicians experimented with sounds that broke the rules of traditional music. Trumpets blared boldly. Saxophones weaved playful melodies through the air. Pianos struck bright chords that invited dancers onto the floor. Soon, jazz began traveling across the Atlantic. Paris quickly embraced it. European audiences were fascinated by the vibrant style and emotional freedom that jazz offered. Nightclubs filled with people eager to hear the latest American bands, performing songs that seemed to pulse with life. The music changed how people behaved. Dance floors that once hosted slow and careful steps now exploded with movement. Couples swung and spun through energetic dances like the Charleston and the Black Bottom. The rhythm encouraged laughter, experimentation, and sometimes a bit of reckless enthusiasm. Older generations watched with concern. To them, jazz seemed chaotic and unruly. The music ignored many of the traditional structures that had defined polite society for decades. Some critics even claimed it encouraged moral decline. But young people loved it. For the new generation, jazz represented freedom. It was bold, exciting, and full of possibility. The music captured the spirit of a decade that refused to live quietly. Clubs dedicated entirely to jazz began appearing in major cities. Dimly lit rooms filled with cigarette smoke and glowing lamps became gathering places for musicians and audiences alike. Wealthy socialites sat beside artists, writers, and curious travellers, all united by the same hypnotic rhythm flowing from the stage. Famous performers soon emerged. Artists like Louis Armstrong transformed the trumpet into a voice that could soar above the orchestra with joyful confidence. Singers began delivering lyrics with emotion and personality that audiences had rarely heard before. Jazz was more than entertainment. It became the soundtrack of an entire era. The Roaring Twenties danced to its rhythm, celebrated its energy, and carried its bold spirit into every corner of modern life. As jazz spread through the cities of the 1920s, another unexpected feature of the decade began to shape its nightlife. Alcohol had been outlawed in the United States. In 1920, the government introduced prohibition, a national ban on the manufacture and sale of alcoholic drinks. The intention was to create a more disciplined and moral society. Many politicians believed that removing alcohol would reduce crime, strengthen families, and bring order to American cities. Instead, something far more interesting happened. Drinking did not disappear. It simply went underground. Across cities like New York and Chicago, secret bars began appearing behind unmarked doors and hidden basements. These establishments became known as speakeasies, places where customers had to whisper quietly to avoid attracting attention from the police. A visitor might walk down a dark alley and knock on an ordinary-looking door. A small window would slide open, and a guard would quietly ask for a password before allowing entry. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but secretive. Speakeasies were lively, crowded places filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Jazz bands played energetic songs while guests danced beneath dim lights. Waiters moved quickly through the room, carrying trays of cocktails, mixed with surprising creativity. Because traditional spirits were difficult to obtain, bartenders experimented with new recipes. Gin, fruit juices, and syrups were blended into colourful drinks that disguised the rough taste of homemade alcohol. Cocktails quickly became fashionable, transforming drinking into a kind of art. The most famous speakeasies became legendary. Some were lavish clubs hidden behind elegant restaurants. Others were small, smoky rooms where musicians played until sunrise. Wealthy businessmen, artists and socialites all gathered together, enjoying the thrill of breaking the law in stylish surroundings. Of course, the illegal alcohol trade attracted powerful criminals. Figures like Al Capone built vast fortunes supplying liquor to these underground bars. Organised crime expanded rapidly, turning the business of alcohol into one of the most profitable enterprises of the decade. Yet for many people, the speakeasy was simply a place to escape reality. Behind those hidden doors, the Roaring Twenties felt unstoppable. Music played loudly, cocktails flowed freely, and the night seemed to promise endless excitement. As jazz echoed through the clubs and cocktails flowed behind hidden doors, another revolution was quietly unfolding in the streets and dance halls of the 1920s. It was the rise of a new kind of woman. For generations, society had expected women to behave with careful restraint. Fashion was heavy and modest. Hair was long and carefully styled. Social rules dictated how women should speak, dress, and behave in public. But the young women of the 1920s had little interest in those traditions. They called themselves flappers. The name itself suggested something light, rebellious, and impossible to control. Flappers rejected the rigid expectations of their parents' generation and embraced a lifestyle filled with freedom, excitement, and independence. The change was visible immediately in fashion. Long skirts disappeared, replaced by shorter dresses that allowed women to move easily on the dance floor. Corsets, which had restricted movement for decades, were abandoned in favour of loose, comfortable clothing. Hair was cut short into sleek bobs. It was a bold decision that shocked many older observers. For centuries, long hair had been considered a symbol of feminine beauty. Now, young women were happily abandoning that tradition. Flappers also behaved differently. They danced enthusiastically to jazz music, smoked cigarettes in public, and spoke openly about their desire for independence. Many worked in offices, shops, and factories, earning their own income and gaining a new sense of personal freedom. To the older generation, this transformation seemed alarming. Newspapers published worried articles about declining morals and rebellious youth. Critics claimed the flapper lifestyle encouraged recklessness and irresponsibility. Yet for the women themselves, the change felt exhilarating. They had lived through a world war that had reshaped society. Many had worked in factories and offices while men were away fighting. Returning to the quiet, restricted life expected before the war felt impossible. The flapper represented something larger than fashion. She symbolized a new era in which women demanded a greater voice in society. Voting rights had recently expanded in many countries, and social expectations were slowly beginning to shift. The Roaring Twenties were not only about jazz, wealth, and glittering parties. They were also about transformation, and the young women dancing across those crowded floors were helping to reshape the modern world. As music filled the dance halls and flappers transformed fashion, another powerful force was shaping the decade: money. During the 1920s, wealth seemed to multiply almost magically. Businesses expanded rapidly, factories produced goods at astonishing speeds, and new industries appeared almost overnight. Automobiles were at the center of this transformation. Henry Ford's assembly line had already changed manufacturing before the war, but now the system reached its full potential. Cars rolled off factory lines in huge numbers, becoming affordable to millions of people who had never imagined owning one. Roads expanded across the countryside, connecting towns and cities like never before. Suddenly, travel felt easy and exciting. Radios also entered everyday life. Families gathered around glowing wooden cabinets to listen to music, news, and entertainment. Advertisements encouraged people to buy the newest products, from refrigerators to stylish clothing. Consumption became part of the culture. People were encouraged to spend money, to enjoy the rewards of modern industry. Department stores displayed elegant goods in brightly lit windows, tempting shoppers with promises of comfort and sophistication. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of this new prosperity was the stock market. In cities like New York, investors rushed to buy shares in companies they believed would grow endlessly. Stock prices climbed steadily higher. Newspapers reported stories of ordinary individuals who had invested small sums and quickly become wealthy. The idea of easy money spread like wildfire. People who had never invested before suddenly opened brokerage accounts. Clerks, teachers, and shopkeepers borrowed money to buy stocks, confident that prices would continue to rise. The market became a kind of national obsession. Crowds gathered outside brokerage offices to watch stock prices being updated on large boards. Conversations in restaurants and taxis often turned to the same subject: which company was climbing fastest? For many Americans, it felt like a golden opportunity. The economy appeared unstoppable. Factories produced goods faster than ever. Cities grew richer. Luxurious lifestyles became increasingly common among those who benefited from the boom. Yet beneath the excitement, a fragile truth remained. Much of this wealth depended on confidence. As long as people believed the market would rise forever, the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties seemed secure. Few stopped to consider what might happen if that confidence ever began to disappear. While wealth surged and cities sparkled with nightlife, another powerful force began shaping the culture of the 1920s: the rise of modern celebrity. For the first time in history, millions of people across different countries began admiring the same famous faces. These new icons did not rule nations or command armies. Instead, they appeared on the silver screen. Cinema was becoming one of the most powerful forms of entertainment in the world. Movie theatres opened in cities and towns everywhere, offering audiences a chance to escape everyday life and enter dazzling worlds of romance, adventure, and glamour. Inside these darkened halls, flickering images told stories that felt larger than life. Hollywood quickly became the center of this new industry. In California, enormous film studios produced movies at astonishing speed. Directors experimented with new techniques, while actors perfected dramatic performances that could communicate emotion without spoken words. After all, most films of the time were still silent. But silence did not prevent these performers from becoming international stars. Names like Charlie Chaplin, Rudolph Valentino, and Clara Bow became instantly recognizable across continents. Their photographs appeared in magazines, newspapers, and advertisements. Audiences adored them. Fans studied the clothing worn by actresses and attempted to copy their hairstyles. Young men admired the confident style of movie heroes and tried to imitate their charm and elegance. The influence of film spread quickly. Fashion designers paid attention to what appeared on screen, knowing that audiences would soon demand similar styles in shops and department stores. Hairstyles, makeup, and even the way people walked began reflecting the glamorous images projected in cinemas. Hollywood itself became a symbol of luxury. Stories circulated about extravagant parties hosted by film stars in enormous mansions. These gatherings seemed to represent the very spirit of the Roaring Twenties: wealth, beauty, excitement, and endless celebration. Yet there was also something deeper happening. Cinema allowed people to share the same dreams. A young factory worker in Chicago could watch the same film as a wealthy businessman in New York or a student in Paris. For a few hours, they all entered the same world of adventure and romance. The 1920s were not only an age of jazz and prosperity, they were also the beginning of modern entertainment culture, and the glittering faces on the silver screen were quickly becoming the heroes and icons of an entire generation. By the late 1920s, the world appeared to be glowing with confidence. Cities sparkled with electric light, jazz continued to pour from nightclubs, and the stock market climbed higher than anyone had ever imagined. To many observers, it seemed that modern society had finally discovered the secret to endless prosperity. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks had already begun to form. The prosperity of the decade was not shared equally. While wealthy investors and businessmen enjoyed enormous profits, many farmers struggled quietly in the countryside. Agricultural prices had fallen after the First World War, leaving farmers trapped with debts and shrinking incomes. Factories also began producing more goods than people could comfortably buy. Store windows were filled with automobiles, radios, and fashionable clothing, yet many families relied on installment plans and borrowed money to afford them. The culture of easy credit allowed people to purchase luxuries immediately, but it also quietly built mountains of debt. The stock market itself was becoming increasingly dangerous. Speculation had replaced careful investing. People bought shares not because they understood the companies behind them, but simply because they believed prices would continue rising. Even banks joined the frenzy. Some financial institutions began lending large sums to investors who used the borrowed money to buy more stocks. This practice allowed people to control enormous investments with relatively small amounts of their own savings. As long as the market continued rising, the system appeared brilliant, but it was also extremely fragile. If stock prices ever began to fall, investors who had borrowed money would be forced to sell quickly. Those rapid sales could push prices down even further, creating a chain reaction that might spread through the entire financial system. Few people wanted to think about that possibility. The parties were too lively, the music too exciting, and the profits too tempting to ignore. Confidence ruled the decade. Newspapers celebrated the booming economy. Wealthy financiers appeared on magazine covers, praised as masters of modern prosperity. Crowds continued gathering outside brokerage offices to watch stock prices rise higher each day. The Roaring Twenties seemed unstoppable. Yet beneath the champagne, the music, and the dazzling lights of the era, the foundations of that prosperity were becoming dangerously unstable. By the autumn of 1929, the confidence of the Roaring Twenties had reached its peak. For nearly a decade, prosperity had seemed unstoppable. Cities had grown brighter, fortunes had multiplied, and the stock market had climbed so high that many people believed it could never fall. Investors spoke with absolute certainty about the future, convinced that modern industry and financial genius had created a permanent age of wealth. But confidence, as it turned out, was far more fragile than anyone imagined. In late October, the first signs of panic began to appear on Wall Street. At first, the changes were subtle. Stock prices dipped slightly as a few nervous investors decided to sell their shares and take profits. Normally, such movements would have passed unnoticed. Markets always rose and fell a little. But this time, something was different. More people began selling. Rumours spread quickly through brokerage offices and crowded trading floors. Investors who had borrowed money to buy stocks suddenly realised that falling prices could destroy them financially. To protect themselves, they rushed to sell before losses became worse. The result was chaos. Thousands of shares flooded the market at once. Prices dropped rapidly. Within hours, fortunes that had taken years to build began to vanish. Crowds gathered outside banks and financial buildings in New York, desperate for news. Newspapers printed extra editions describing the dramatic collapse of the stock market. Inside the exchange, traders shouted orders while prices plunged faster than anyone could track. The crash did not destroy the world overnight, but it shattered the illusion that the prosperity of the 1920s would last forever. Banks began failing as loans went unpaid. Businesses closed when customers could no longer afford their products. Unemployment rose as factories reduced production. The glittering parties that had defined the decade slowly disappeared. Jazz clubs still played music, but the mood had changed. The laughter felt quieter. The confidence that had once filled every corner of society had faded into uncertainty. Looking back, the Roaring Twenties seemed almost dreamlike. For a brief moment, the world had believed it was entering an endless golden age of luxury and excitement, an era of wealth and celebration that echoed the extravagant confidence once seen aboard ships like the Titanic. But just as that great liner had struck the cold Atlantic unexpectedly, the decade's dazzling prosperity had collided with reality, and when the music finally stopped, a very different era was about to begin. In the ancient world, the education of a royal child began long before the child understood what a throne truly meant. From the moment a prince or princess was born, their life was shaped by expectation. They were not simply children growing up inside palaces. They were future rulers, individuals who might one day command armies, judge disputes, and negotiate with powerful rivals. Every lesson they received carried enormous weight. Ordinary children in ancient societies might learn basic skills from their parents. A farmer's son learned to work the fields. A craftsman's daughter learned the trade of her household. Their education was practical, built around survival and daily life. But royal children lived in an entirely different world. Their classrooms were palaces, temples, and private courtyards. Instead of parents alone guiding their early years, they were surrounded by tutors, philosophers, priests, and military instructors carefully chosen by the royal court. Each teacher brought knowledge that was meant to shape the mind of a future ruler. Some lessons focused on language and literature. Princes were expected to read sacred texts, royal decrees, and historical records. Understanding the past was considered essential for governing the future. Other lessons focused on politics. A young heir needed to understand alliances, diplomacy, and the fragile balance between powerful families and neighbouring kingdoms. A careless decision by a king could start a war or destroy a dynasty. Physical training was equally important. Royal children learned riding, archery, swordsmanship, and strategy. Even those destined primarily for leadership rather than battle were expected to understand warfare. A ruler who could not command an army would struggle to maintain authority. Religion also played a central role in their education. In many ancient cultures, kings were believed to rule with divine approval. Priests therefore instructed royal children in rituals, sacred traditions, and the complex relationship between the throne and the gods. But perhaps the most important lesson was something less obvious. Royal children were trained to think. Philosophers encouraged them to question ideas, debate moral dilemmas, and examine the nature of justice and power. The goal was not only knowledge, but wisdom. Because in the ancient world, the education of a prince or princess was never simply about learning facts. It was about preparing a human being to carry the enormous burden of ruling others. In some ancient kingdoms, the education of royal children reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Rulers understood that the future stability of their empires depended heavily on the minds of their heirs, so they searched for the most brilliant teachers available. In ancient Greece, philosophy was considered one of the highest forms of knowledge, and many royal courts invited famous thinkers to guide young princes. These philosophers were not merely instructors who taught grammar or mathematics. They were mentors responsible for shaping how future kings understood the world. Perhaps the most famous example occurred in the 4th century before Christ. The Macedonian king Philip II wanted the best possible education for his son, Alexander. To achieve this, he invited one of the greatest philosophers in history to serve as the prince's tutor. That philosopher was Aristotle. Aristotle was already renowned throughout Greece for his work in logic, science, politics, and ethics. Under his guidance, Alexander studied a remarkable range of subjects. Literature, geography, medicine, zoology, philosophy, and political theory were all part of the young prince's daily routine. Lessons did not always take place in formal classrooms. Many were held outdoors while walking through gardens or along shaded pathways. Aristotle believed discussion and observation were essential tools for learning. He encouraged Alexander to ask questions and examine ideas rather than simply memorizing information. This style of teaching had a lasting impact. Alexander developed a deep admiration for Greek culture, literature, and philosophy. Even during his military campaigns years later, he carried copies of Homer's epic poems and often discussed philosophical ideas with his companions. But philosophers also taught moral responsibility. They asked young rulers to consider difficult questions about justice, leadership, and the proper use of power. What made a ruler legitimate? How should a king treat conquered peoples? When was war justified? These questions were not theoretical. A prince might soon face such decisions in reality. Philosophers therefore acted as guides for the mind and conscience of future rulers. They hoped their lessons would produce leaders who governed wisely, rather than simply ruling by force. Of course, history shows that even the best education could not guarantee perfect rulers. Yet the presence of philosophers in royal courts reveals something important about the ancient world. Kings understood that knowledge itself could be one of the most powerful tools of leadership. While philosophers shaped the minds of royal children, another group of instructors shaped their bodies. In the ancient world, a ruler was expected to understand war. Even kings who rarely fought personally needed to command armies, organize defenses, and make decisions that determined the outcome of battles. For this reason, the physical training of princes began early and continued throughout their youth. Royal education was never confined to books and scrolls. Young heirs were taken outside the palace walls to train in riding, archery, and combat. Skilled warriors served as instructors, teaching them how to handle weapons and move confidently on the battlefield. Horseback riding was especially important. Across many ancient civilizations, from Persia to Macedonia, cavalry played a crucial role in warfare. Princes therefore spent countless hours learning to control powerful horses, guiding them across difficult terrain while carrying weapons. Balance, strength, and discipline were essential. Archery was another fundamental skill. A future ruler needed to understand the weapons used by his soldiers. By practicing with bow and arrow, royal students developed both accuracy and patience, qualities equally useful in war and leadership. Swordsmanship training could be intense. Instructors taught princes how to hold a blade, how to strike, and how to defend themselves against an opponent. Wooden practice weapons were often used at first, but the lessons remained serious. Even in training, a careless movement could cause injury. Yet the purpose of this education was not simply to produce skilled fighters. It was meant to build courage. Ancient societies admired rulers who shared the dangers faced by their soldiers. Kings who understood the hardships of the battlefield earned greater loyalty from their armies. Some royal students embraced these lessons enthusiastically. Alexander of Macedon, for example, became an exceptional horseman and warrior during his youth. His famous horse, Bucephalus, was said to accept no rider except the young prince, a story that later symbolized Alexander's courage and determination. Military education also included strategy. Young princes studied famous battles from the past and learned how generals positioned their forces. They practiced planning attacks and defending territories, sometimes using models of landscapes to simulate real campaigns. By the time a royal heir reached adulthood, they were expected to possess both intellectual knowledge and physical confidence. Because in the ancient world, ruling a kingdom often meant leading an army, and a king who did not understand war could easily lose his throne. While Greek princes studied with philosophers and trained for war, royal education in ancient Egypt followed a very different path. Knowledge in Egypt was closely tied to religion. The pharaoh was not simply a political ruler. He was believed to be a divine figure, a living bridge between the gods and the people. Because of this sacred role, the education of royal children often took place within temple complexes, under the supervision of powerful priests. These temples were more than places of worship. They were centers of learning. Within their walls, priests preserved ancient texts, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and sacred rituals that had been passed down for centuries. Only a select few were allowed to study these teachings. Royal children were among them. Young princes sometimes attended what historians call the House of Life, an institution connected to major temples where scribes and priests studied religion, science, and administration. These schools were not open to ordinary Egyptians. They were reserved for the elite. The lessons taught they were complex and demanding. Royal students learned to read and write hieroglyphs, one of the most intricate writing systems ever developed. They studied sacred myths, describing the gods and the origins of the world. They also learned rituals. A pharaoh was expected to perform ceremonies that honored the gods and maintained cosmic order. Priests therefore taught royal children the precise movements, prayers, and offerings required for temple rituals. Astronomy was another important subject. Egyptian priests carefully observed the stars, using them to calculate the flooding of the Nile and to determine religious festivals. Royal students studied these celestial patterns so they could understand the rhythms that governed Egyptian life. Mathematics and administration were equally vital. A ruler needed to manage land, organize labor, and oversee massive construction projects such as temples and pyramids. Understanding numbers, measurements, and record-keeping allowed royal heirs to govern effectively. Yet many aspects of this education remained secret. Priests guarded certain religious teachings closely, sharing them only with trusted initiates. Royal children who studied within temple schools gained access to knowledge that reinforced their sacred authority. By learning these hidden traditions, a future pharaoh did more than gain education. He inherited the spiritual legitimacy that supported the entire Egyptian kingdom. While Egypt trained its royal children within sacred temples, the Persian Empire developed its own remarkable system of royal education. The Persians believed that the character of a ruler was just as important as his knowledge. To govern a vast empire stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, a king needed discipline, honesty, courage, and self-control. These qualities were not expected to appear naturally. They had to be taught carefully during childhood. Greek historians, especially Herodotus, described how Persian noble boys were educated. From the age of about 5 until 20, the sons of Persian elites attended what could almost be described as royal academies. These schools were not luxurious palaces filled with comfort. Instead, they were places designed to build strength and character. The lessons were surprisingly simple. According to Persian tradition, young nobles were taught 3 essential skills: to ride a horse, to draw a bow, and to speak the truth. Horse riding was vital because the Persian Empire relied heavily on cavalry. Royal children learned to ride across open plains and rugged landscapes, developing both confidence and physical endurance. Archery training followed closely behind. The bow was one of the most important weapons in Persian warfare. Princes practiced shooting at distant targets, learning patience and precision while mastering the weapon their soldiers would use in battle. But perhaps the most interesting lesson was honesty. Persian culture placed enormous importance on truthfulness. Lying was considered one of the most shameful behaviours a person could commit. Royal children were therefore trained to speak truthfully and keep their promises, qualities believed essential for a trustworthy ruler. Education also included moral instruction rooted in Zoroastrian beliefs. Teachers spoke about the struggle between truth and falsehood, good and evil. A future king was expected to protect justice and resist corruption, maintaining order within the empire. Physical endurance was another priority. Young nobles sometimes trained outdoors in difficult conditions. They rode long distances, hunted animals, and practiced surviving in harsh environments. These experiences were meant to prepare them for the hardships of leadership and war. Unlike the philosophical education of Greece or the priestly instruction of Egypt, Persian royal education focused heavily on character. The goal was to produce rulers who were brave, disciplined, and morally strong. Because in an empire that stretched across thousands of miles, the personal character of the king could determine the fate of millions. As the ancient Mediterranean world changed, the Romans developed their own approach to educating the children of powerful families. In Rome, education was closely connected to politics. The Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, depended on leaders who could speak persuasively, command respect, and navigate the complicated world of alliances and rivalries within the Senate and the army. For this reason, the education of elite Roman children focused heavily on rhetoric. Rhetoric was the art of public speaking. Young nobles spent countless hours learning how to argue a case, persuade an audience, and deliver speeches that could sway political decisions. A skilled speaker could win elections, defend himself in court, or inspire soldiers before battle. Teachers known as rhetoricians guided these lessons. Students practiced by debating historical events or imaginary legal cases. They learned how to structure arguments carefully, how to control their tone of voice, and how to present themselves with confidence before an audience. For the sons of powerful Roman families, this training was essential. Politics in Rome could be ruthless. Senators competed fiercely for influence and prestige. A man who could not speak effectively in public often struggled to advance his career. Roman education also included literature. Students studied the works of famous poets and historians such as Homer, Virgil, and Livy. By reading these texts, they learned language, history, and moral examples that were believed to shape their character. Philosophy was sometimes included as well. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, for example, later became tutor to the young Emperor Nero. Seneca hoped to guide the future ruler toward wisdom and restraint through philosophical teachings about virtue and self-control. Unfortunately, the results were mixed. Nero eventually became infamous for his cruelty and excess, a reminder that even the best teachers could not always shape the character of powerful rulers. Yet Roman education remained influential. Young nobles also trained physically through sports, riding, and military exercises. Like their Greek and Persian counterparts, they were expected to understand warfare and leadership. By the time a Roman aristocrat reached adulthood, he was expected to possess a wide range of abilities. He needed to read history, debate ideas, command soldiers, and speak confidently before the Senate. Because in Rome, power did not belong only to the strongest. It belonged to those who could persuade others to follow them. By the time royal children reached adolescence, their education expanded beyond philosophy, religion, and warfare. They also had to learn something equally important: how to survive the royal court. Ancient courts were complicated environments filled with powerful families, ambitious advisors, and rival factions competing for influence. A young prince or princess needed to understand this delicate world long before they inherited authority. Mistakes could be dangerous. Royal tutors therefore introduced lessons in diplomacy. Students studied how alliances were formed between kingdoms, how marriages could strengthen political ties, and how carefully chosen words could prevent conflicts from escalating into war. Conversation itself became a skill. Future rulers practiced speaking respectfully to powerful nobles while still maintaining authority. They learned how to listen carefully, observe hidden motives, and respond without revealing too much of their own intentions. These lessons often took place during real court gatherings. Royal children were expected to observe discussions between diplomats, ambassadors, and advisors. By watching experienced leaders negotiate treaties or resolve disputes, they gradually learned the subtle rules of political interaction. Court etiquette was equally important. A prince needed to know how to behave in public ceremonies, how to greet foreign envoys, and how to display generosity without appearing weak. Every gesture carried meaning in a royal court. Even body language mattered. Standing too proudly could be interpreted as arrogance. Appearing too humble might signal weakness. Tutors therefore coached royal students carefully, ensuring they understood the balance required to project confidence and authority. Marriage diplomacy also became part of their education. Royal children knew that their future marriages might be arranged to strengthen alliances between kingdoms. Princes and princesses were therefore taught foreign languages, cultural customs, and the traditions of neighbouring states. Understanding another culture could help prevent misunderstandings that might otherwise lead to conflict. But perhaps the most difficult lesson involved trust. Royal courts were famous for intrigue. Advisors might secretly pursue their own ambitions. Relatives sometimes competed for the throne itself. Young heirs needed to learn whom they could rely upon and whom they should watch carefully. This education prepared them for a harsh reality. Ruling a kingdom required far more than intelligence or courage. It demanded the ability to navigate a world of ambition, loyalty, and deception. And for a future monarch, mastering the politics of the court was often the difference between survival and disaster. As royal students grew older, their education increasingly centered on knowledge of the wider world. A future ruler could not remain ignorant of distant lands, rival kingdoms, or the ideas shaping foreign cultures. Understanding geography, history, and the traditions of other civilizations was considered essential preparation for leadership. For this reason, many royal courts developed impressive libraries. These collections were far more than decorative displays of scrolls and manuscripts. They served as repositories of knowledge gathered from across the ancient world. Histories, philosophical writings, religious texts, medical treatises, and works of poetry all filled the shelves. Royal students spent long hours studying these materials. In ancient Greece and later in the Hellenistic kingdoms, education often included the works of Homer, whose epic poems described heroes, wars, and moral choices. These stories were not read simply for entertainment. They were treated as lessons in courage, loyalty, and leadership. In other regions, similar texts shaped royal thinking. Persian princes studied records of previous kings and the traditions that governed their empire. Egyptian heirs learned sacred writings describing the duties of a pharaoh and the responsibilities of maintaining harmony between the gods and humanity. Libraries also introduced students to geography. Maps and travel accounts described distant territories, unfamiliar peoples, and trade routes connecting different parts of the world. This knowledge helped future rulers understand the political landscape beyond their borders. Diplomacy often depended on such awareness. A king who understood the culture and ambitions of neighbouring states could negotiate more effectively and avoid unnecessary conflict. Some royal courts became famous centres of learning. The Library of Alexandria, founded during the Hellenistic period, attempted to gather every book known to the ancient world. Scholars from many lands travelled there to study and exchange ideas. Royal patrons supported these scholars because knowledge itself strengthened political authority. For royal students, access to such resources was a privilege. They were encouraged to debate ideas with tutors, analyse historical events, and consider how past rulers had succeeded or failed. Through this process, education expanded beyond simple instruction. It became an exploration of human experience. By reading about distant lands, ancient battles, and philosophical arguments, future rulers developed the intellectual tools needed to understand the complex world they would soon govern. Because in the ancient world, knowledge was not merely an ornament of power, it was one of its foundations. Eventually, every royal education reached the same moment. the moment when lessons ended and real power began. For years, royal children had studied philosophy, religion, diplomacy, and warfare. Tutors had guided their thoughts, priests had explained sacred traditions, and generals had trained them in the realities of battle. But none of these lessons truly mattered until the young heir stepped into the world of leadership. The final stage of royal education was experience. Before inheriting a throne, many princes were gradually introduced to the responsibilities of governance. They attended council meetings, listened to advisors debate policy, and observed how their parents made decisions affecting entire kingdoms. Sometimes they were given small tasks. A young prince might be asked to oversee a minor administrative duty, settle disputes between local officials, or accompany diplomats during negotiations with neighbouring states. These responsibilities allowed the student to practice ruling under the guidance of experienced mentors. Military leadership also became part of this final training. Some heirs joined military campaigns alongside seasoned commanders. They observed how armies moved, how strategies were formed, and how discipline was maintained among soldiers. In certain cases, princes were even allowed to command small units, testing their ability to inspire loyalty and make decisions under pressure. The results could shape their reputation for life. Alexander of Macedon first proved his leadership abilities by commanding cavalry in battle while still a young prince. His success earned the admiration of experienced soldiers, strengthening his claim to authority long before he became king. Yet not every royal student passed this test successfully. History offers many examples of rulers who received excellent educations but failed to govern wisely. Some lacked discipline. Others ignored the moral lessons their tutors had tried to teach. Power, after all, can reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of a person's character. For those who succeeded, however, royal education achieved its purpose. It produced leaders capable of navigating war, diplomacy, religion, and politics in a complex and often dangerous world. In ancient societies, where the fate of nations rested in the hands of a single ruler, education was never treated lightly. It was the careful preparation of a human mind for the enormous responsibility of power. And when a prince finally ascended the throne, every lesson from childhood would shape the decisions that followed.